Hello, everyone. Welcome to Beers with VCS, where we have casual conversations about the less talked about aspects of venture capital and startup building. We are your hosts, Sabrina Passman and Simon Lancaster, and today we are very excited to be joined by Doug Harrison, CEO of the Rise Club. He's helped thousands of brands, businesses, and people recraft their company missions over the course of his career and has too many career highlights to mention, but some of my favorites are he was the brain behind the Coca-Cola Happiness Campaign, earned Vendor of the Year at Coca-Cola and finalist at Microsoft. He's also an author and wrote a book on his approach called The Rise Framework. Doug, it's a huge pleasure to have you on. Welcome to our podcast.
Welcome, Doug.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Of course. So I think to start off today, we'll show we're all drinking. I've got a little bit of a boring one today. I've got some lemon tea, but it's cold. It's nice for the summertime.
I was told there would be beers.
Yes, I know.
I didn't bring a beer. If you want me to go next and be shameless, I am drinking hard kombucha, Flying Embers, guava citrus flavor. Pretty excited about this one, although it is 8.5%. So we'll see how I am by the end of the session.
It's a sneaky one for sure.
Well, since it doesn't have to be beer, I brought Rombauer Chardonnay, which nice. I think we'll tie back to as we go through this. It's one of the brands that I worked on. It had a wonderful outcome. One of my favorites. So it'll tie in nicely.
We're so excited to dive into that.
I think you're the first white wine on the show.
Yeah, so definitely the classiest guest that we've had so far.
It is classy. It is classy. Yeah.
Well, just to downgrade it a little bit, among older women, this is known as cougar juice. There's all kinds of nicknames for Rombauer.
It's a great one.
You can check it out.
It's a great one. So before we get into the formal thing, I do have to. I'm going to give a shout out to how we met, Doug, which was I think very serendipitous and awesome. So this year, I attended Summit at Sea, which was a really cool week on the Virgin cruise ship networking events and really really cool art and entertainment combined with investment and venture. And Doug was there. Doug was killing it in the pickup band, singing 90s alternative rock, and it just brought me back like to my teenage years and college years. Is really 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 cool way to meet you, and it's like seared into my memory now. So it's great, yeah. And to have come like now, yeah. So yeah,
so cool.
Thanks for that, Doug.
Yeah, it was so fun. I had a great time. I'm so happy I got to meet you, Simon. I'm really, and Sabrina, and psyched about what some of the early things we've already been able to do together, and just looking forward to all the additional things we'll do.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to set more context, like Doug has helped us at Omni totally redo our own pitch. And so there's many juicy insights, not just for founders, but also for VCs to pull out from the conversation we'll be having today. And I think to dive right in, Doug, you've had an incredible career helping companies recraft their visions. And I think one thing that's interesting is that a lot of people say that, most people suck at storytelling. There are some, key metrics to like succeed in storytelling, but the framework that you actually gave us was completely novel for us. And I'd love for you to guide us through a little bit about your journey into how you discovered all of this new framework that you've created, and also some aha moments that you had throughout your career that kind of understood the commonalities between shitty stories in the past. Let us know where you want to start.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. I'd say that, to keep it kind of on the most meaningful stuff, because as I approach time I engage with clients or anybody, I'm always striving to operate on their highest level. So I'm going to hit on the things that I've learned over my life that have turned out to be the most transformative, and the people that cause people to say, holy shit, I didn't know that, and I need to know that. So, in terms of it's really been an evolution process in working with different brands and businesses, and I had a market research consulting shop for a number of years. All the video games that go to the world go through an evolution process. We created a big wealth practice with American Express, did a lot of that branding that you mentioned, and et cetera. And I sold that company built it to one of the larger global platforms, and then sold that company about 10 years ago. Moved to California, started operating out of a space of kindness and helpfulness to people, and started having a lot more small and mid-sized companies come to me. And again, just trying to be helpful to people. And as I was going through it, there was one particular instance where I was working with somebody and I was like, I've seen this before. I've seen this mind trap that people slip into before. And these common things that people do that really work against their best interest and become sort of an eroding factor on their conversions and success and culture and business planning. And it's literally everything. And they have no awareness of it. And I grew up in a household where I was sort of felt a little bit at risk. So I learned deep empathy very, very early. And it became a skill that was incredibly helpful to me. And I came to the conclusion that the single most dominant mistake that I see everybody slip into that kills the way we present ourselves is how people slip into what I describe as first person mindset. We immediately go into this mode of, here's what I do. Here's what you need to know about me. Here's what my product does. And they don't take responsibility really for the conclusions. They don't even think about it 99% of the time. This is like everybody. There's different forms and matters in the ways that this plays out. But everybody does it, including myself. But I remember that first time that I had a particular client, and I ended up identifying these 10 mind traps that people slip into that are all caused by this first person mentality that they have. And I can get into this, but I also am trying not to just ramble on completely.
Yeah, I think just go for it, Simon.
I was going to say I totally see like the helping nature that you have. I think you've been very helpful for us, and you're I think one of the most forward, helpful people, selfless people with your time. And it's interesting to like hear the root of the framework, and that it's kind of based on deep empathy, basically. It's interesting. I'm excited to explore that more.
Yeah, it's a really a big mind shift, and it's perhaps I think the most powerful things people can do. And I would really encourage anybody who listens or watches this to go back and either look at their portfolio companies, themselves, and or their websites, their communications, and look at any of it and ask yourself the question, did I go into this thinking about what is the right thing to say? What do I need to tell somebody? And so, kind of my starting place is always like step into third person mode and really do everything you can to imagine the conclusions that the person on the other side is going to draw based on all the signals that they can get. And what I've found, I've literally never found a case where there's not a pretty meaningful disparity between what a person hopes somebody would conclude about them relative to the truth of what they are. It's also really hard to do this for yourself, honestly. I do this for a living, and I still slip into all these mind traps. I think probably the biggest one I call the copycatter, and I see copycatting everywhere I go. I ran into a founder recently who had a company that does data analytics and interpretation, and I said, "Oh, so what is your headline or promise?" I go, "Is it something like finding greater insights through deeper data interpretation?" And he looked on his website. He's like, "Oh shit, that is basically what we're saying." And what's happened to people is we go into these modes. What I find is people feel like their propositions are so complicated that they're not really sure how to package it all into a manner that people can really digest and latch onto. And so they sort of fall back and be like, well, this is a good way to say it. and it sort of sounds good at the surface. That's what a copycatter does, but you're kind of like, after you see it, if you really question it, you're like, shit, that sounds the same as everybody else sounds. And, and you have to give people a distinctive reason why to buy you versus somebody else. So I find, certain industries particularly prone to copycatting, but it also can just come through in the phrases that you use. So I actually, what I have to do is I actually force myself, I do my best that I can, and then I go back and check or have somebody check me, and I'm like, oh, there's one of those phrases that's become meaningless because I've heard it so many times. So it's kind of like come in and find ways to express ways that are distinctive, yet familiar. And I find that's really the sweet spot. And I've done this so many times now. I've gotten so I can be really fast and efficient when I work with people to like get to the heart and soul of why you matter really efficiently. My favorite thing that I hear from people is this is what I always wanted to say about us, but I never knew how. And I hear that every time that I do this stuff. And the other thing that's been sort of wonderful that I found over time is that it works whether you're already a super successful company or you're just getting started as a solopreneur. That's the same kind of process works regardless, because it's really just about how you package your way of telling and presenting yourself to the world. And to be completely transparent, I hate elevator pitches. And most of the time, I'm not a big fan of the way storytelling gets talked about, because I see people present storytelling as if that's, as if everybody had the same amount of time to hear a story. And, so I've found what I landed on in building out the RISE framework, and that structure allows people to convey their story in bite-sized chunks so that it works whether you have 10 seconds or 30 minutes to engage with somebody, and everybody will draw the same conclusion.
Yeah, I really like the framework that you developed, and that there is still a structure, but it's customizable to any length of time. And I think it comes down to understanding what the essence is of what you're trying to communicate. I love what you said just now of distinctive yet familiar. Because we're a deep tech VC, because we work with so many founders that are building something that is completely novel, and any founder will say like there's no comparison for what I'm working on. And the way that they try to describe it typically is they add more and more detail that obfuscates the true essence of their message, and it becomes really hard to differentiate. And then of course there's all of this industry jargon that sounds like all of the other industry jargon and becomes very challenging to actually understand any differences, even though it is a very specific industry. And so you absolutely helped us with that, with our own pitch. And we're going to dive into that later in the conversation. But I'd love to dive into, I think, 4 of those mind traps that you talked about. The 4 that I was really excited about were the copycatter, the feature lister, tactician, and over-explainer. I think those are my 4 favorite ones. And I'd love to go through case studies just to like contextualize it for the audience. I'm happy to, maybe we can start with the copycatter and kind of like go through like the case study of KCL engineering for our technical audience, and we can kind of like branch out from there.
Yeah, for sure. So the copycatter, as I kind of gave the headline of that, of what it is about. And what's cool about the RISE framework, and maybe I should explain a little bit just how the RISE framework works as an overview so people understand. Because I talk about owning your mountain. How do you own your mountain? And I love the mountain framework and the mindset, because the way that I actually approach businesses is I pay a bit less attention to the competitive landscape than a lot of people, because what I find is when you get too focused on the competitive landscape, it sort of bleeds into your vernacular and you end up sounding and doing things like everybody else, when you need to just stay focused on the end person that you're trying to attract and what's going to work with them. So the RISE framework, and the way that the structure, and this is important to go into the case study, but it's a mountain shape, and up at the top is your promise, and the promise is a short phrase. It might even be a single word, Under the promise is 3 pillars. And I really like to stick with 3. And these are the headline territories of the way that you present your proposition to the world. And this is probably the single most important part of the entire thing, because without it, people tend to go from a promise or their tagline all the way down to a lot of details, which is that feature lister that you talk about. And so there's no structure. And what people don't realize is that the human mind is actually doing paired comparisons with all the points that you're trying to make to them to see if they can all make sense together, because they're looking for inconsistency. So if you got a lot of points, you're requiring this person to go, oh, this plus this with that, or this or that. And then, if they can find any points of discontinuity, it's an opportunity to reject and keep their money in their pocket, and they're very happy. So you have your promise, then 3 pillars. One's usually product, one's often process, and people is the third. Under each of the pillar headings are proof points. That's the evidence that the pillar is true. And under the proof points is what I call the power plant. That's the operational construct that enable the proof points to be delivered, that add up to the pillars and become the promise. And so it works every time, and I consistently produce at least a 20% lift in conversion rates anytime I do this with anybody. And you can do this where other companies will spend like 6 months or 3 months or a month even going through this. Like, we can bang through this very fast now. So I love digesting stuff like this. It's like my favorite thing to do. So the KCL experience, in talking with them, the thing that I witnessed that they were going into is like, it's an engineering company. So like, we do great. Here's our portfolio. It's like, you go to the website, there's the portfolio of projects that they've done. Under, next to it is, it's a quality team, with senior leadership, and they're very committed to your project. You want to come work with us. And they're like, we're having a really hard time winning any new clients. And I always like to talk to clients as well, at least, 5 or 10. And I'm like, that's because you sound the exact same as everybody else. Everybody does the exact same thing, the essence of copycatting. So it's not that what they were doing is wrong. It's just that it needed to be articulated and presented a way that is distinctive and stands out in the world. So, for example, one of my favorites was, because they're talking about the quality approach and we do quality work, and I'm like, oh God, if I hear anybody tell me quality work again, nobody wants to hear that. So instead, that turned into a pillar heading of a relentless attention to detail. And it's a subtle thing at the surface, but what it did was it's like, oh, it invites the question. That's always a really important part of my pillars as well, is it invites a question. What do you mean by that? So in this case, a relentless attention to detail. Well, what do you mean by that? And so and then we equipped them with the proof points underneath that. In this case, there were 2 headline areas, kind of the preventative and then the responsive side of things. So we had our evidence points all in place on how we prevent any mistakes from happening. So they were able to convey that, and then, but we can't always prevent an issue. So here's what we do if there ever is a problem. So we're all prepared for any of that. So, and there's more detail that can go into that, that gets into how the power plant all worked into it. But then one of the other headline elements, one of the other pillars was, it's like, here's our quality team, and it's a senior team, and it's, it's like another ho-hum moment. And so I'm like, what if we were, and really the architects that they serve were looking for someone to be a perfect extension of their team. And so that's what the other pillar heading became, is and then it's like, well, how do we become a perfect extension of your team? Well, one of the first things that we talked about was the clients were I'm looking for someone who can speak engineer and human. And so we talked about, well, we hire for those kind of people. And, the architect, what they're trying to avoid is the risk of some engineer who gets brought in front of a client, starts babbling. And, and it's like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So we became more about the perfect extension of their team and how they equipped with that. And the cool thing about that was the next week they met with a prospect and they sold a $500,000 project. And they actually never, and there's a third one, which was practical inspired innovation was the third area, which dealt with some things. But what was really cool was that the prospect never got past perfect extension of the team because that was the thing they really wanted to dial into. Mm-hmm. So the pillar headings give you these headline elements of why and how you matter that can work and be organized for a prospect who's hearing it, because they can't really handle more than 3 headlines to have everything organized in. And then let them kind of pick what they want, and then you can dive down into each. And this is where it doesn't become overly scripted, because while 2 people would both talk about the perfect extension of the team, they'll also bring their own stories to that of how they actually engage with somebody. So you have a consistency and conclusion and a framework across an organization that still allows the humanness to come through.
Yeah. There's 2 things that I love about that example. The first is that, their original pitch, there's nothing that's necessarily bad about it, in the sense of all of the words that they're saying are the words that people think people want to hear, right? It's not, there's nothing inherently wrong with saying like they're a quality team, except for the fact that it doesn't describe anything and doesn't actually answer the concerns of the customer itself, because it is such a generic statement. And so I think I really like the way that you broke it down into kind of 3 different pillars that were actionable, that allowed them to create messaging, like given any scenario, basically. So saying that they have, being an extension of the team means that, okay, well, if any given customer has any given problem and they describe the problem, they can say, oh, our team can help with that exactly, because we already have this predetermined framework. So I think the idea of having 3 pillars that you can come to in any meeting that you have with this new framework allows you the flexibility to be able to like pivot your story to really be nimble inside of a sales environment. And that was absolutely applied to us at Omni as well. And it's been very transformative, and really, really liked that. And I think that also ties into my second favorite part, which is I love that your vision of this mountain of like the point with 3 supporting pillars and sub-examples is different than just the typical North Star. I mean, people think of like the North Star message that people try to communicate, and it doesn't have any substance under it. Like it's a nice shiny thing far off in the distance, but there's no substantiation between your sales funnel that you can actually say, okay, well, if you want to get there, how do I actually do it? And so I think the way that you've broken down the copycatter example makes complete sense. I love the it's actionable, which as an engineer I love. Yeah, for like really enjoy that one.
Yeah, and that structure is super important, and I do see that all the time where it gets into one of the other things that I talk to people about is a focus on cleverness versus meaning, because you do run into people sometimes with their communications and they think of something clever and it may attract attention, but they haven't even prepared for the substance that sits behind it. The other great thing about having the structure that is absolutely critical for businesses is once you have those 3 headline areas, it also drives all of your product development because you're like, and all of your culture activities, because it's like everything now is fitting into these, either the product or the proof points or the pillar. Everything's got to load in there, because there's an understanding within the organization that if we can nail all of these, we win. And because nobody else executes at that level. Everybody else is executing with, here's my stuff and, here's my data dump of features. I saw that in private. We did a lot of work in private aviation. I was always stunned that in the world of private aviation, they turned these magnificent airplanes into a bag of features. And they tried to compete with each other on feature list. And what always happened was that, well, this aircraft had these three things that this other one didn't, but they had their gaps. And then the buyers used that against each other to be like, well, and there's no all kinds of lack of emotional connection. And so it just it's so powerful when you get your entire organization organized around this. It's a game changer for people. It goes way beyond messaging and communications. That's why I think of this more as business building, with the branding element. Because the other thing that I think people make a mistake of is branding is an outcome variable. A lot of times they try to treat it as an input, and it's not. A great brand should be the conclusions of the best of who you are and who you choose to be in the future, so that there's room to grow into it more and more over time. But it always comes from farming and getting to the heart of the truth of why and how you distinctively matter. It always works, honestly, because we have all this time we spend working on products to make them amazing, but then we're kind of short on time a lot of times, or we got to get the messaging and we got to get it out to the world. And I get that. But then people sort of forget about it a lot of times because we just do our thing, and you kind of go into this mindset of you win some, you lose some, and it's like, and it's not A/B testing. A/B testing doesn't do that, because A/B testing is already when you've decided, well, we're in this pond. It's not about, it's like, what about if there's this lake over here that we're missing, and we're over here trying to, figure out which is the right lure, when, there's huge fish over in this other pond that we didn't even get to.
Yeah. I think that's a really good segue into the second mind trap, which is feature listing. You were talking a little bit about how feature listers have a really hard time differentiating themselves in the market because they get so focused on one little narrow sliver as opposed to thinking of the whole lake of options of what they could actually be discussing. Do we want to dive into the Zendy example?
And engineers like us
exactly.
would love our
I'd be
feature
happy to.
listing.
Mm-hmm.
Guilty as charged.
Oh, yes, you do. And you guys were totally, the first thing that I saw that you shared with me, you 100% were in the feature listing world.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it's totally natural. And if you come through and you spend all this time and energy and money building out this feature set, you're like, you're already down in the weeds so much, and so what happens is it just becomes really overwhelming for people. And so part of the process, for people who want to try and do this on their own, it is hard to do, but you can definitely do it. Is I just get people to do a dump of like, what are all the benefits and advantages that we have, and how can we organize? And then once it's done, kind of pick your favorite out of that list. And then, well, how might I organize them into 3 buckets? And then once they're organized into the 3 buckets, it's like, well, what would be a logical headline that I could put on top of that? And then what would that add up to as a promise? So, people can attempt, work on toward that end to make that happen. But when I started working with Zendy, they were unbelievably lost in the feature list, to the point where what they ended up doing is almost like their demos were more like a training session of all the feature functionality. And it's like, oh, get people to use it. And I'm like, no, we're not trying to get people trained. What we're trying to do is just solve as many things as possible in order for them to know that this is the right thing. That's all we have to solve for. We don't need anything more other than like, yes, this is the right thing for me. So they were kind of, had a lot going on with the technology, but the other platform in what they had was setting the new standard in distributed energy system design and optimization. That's really what they were doing, was looking to set a new standard. But they were so busy being lost in the features, they didn't really express that and claim it. And so that's what we said. You're going to start with, owning microgrids. And And in that case, we ended up, where did I write those notes down? We ended up talking about having an optimized platform. It's like, because they did have an optimized platform to be able to jump into any of the different elements. And solve in very proactive ways. And
No, it looks like we're having a little bit of Wi-Fi issues, Doug. Are you still there?
Didn't actually, I wrote down all the other ones down on this one. But anyway, we ended up focusing on all of the elements of what does it mean to grow with them. So because people would start with microgrids that were apart that they needed to expand and grow with them. So it was really tying into the connection of what it is that they needed to solve for at the end of the day.
Yeah. And I think we can give a little brief example also of a sliver of how you helped Omni with our pitch of feature listing. I think one thing that we fell into the trap of that you helped pull us out was that every time we gave a pitch, we would take the main pieces of feedback that people gave us and we'd incorporate it into our pitch. And we just did that serially, basically over the course of a year and a half. Anytime we got a piece of feedback, we just slap it onto the end of our deck and say, all right, we now have a new feature that we're going to add and say, like, we now do this thing that this person had an objection about. And what happened actually, which we didn't even realize, was our pitch had like 15 different points in it that were not quite related. All of them independently were good points, but because there were so many of them and because they didn't actually combine into a unified story at all, it caused inconsistencies in our pitch where all of them were individually good, but because they didn't relate, there was a trust issue that happened whenever we gave our pitch. People were like, well, what exactly are they doing? We're probably gonna have a whole breakout session, honestly, and how, Doug, you've helped us transform our pitch. But I think one of the main things that no one had ever told us before we met you is that just having a string of like 15 good things like is not a good pitch. Like it needs to have a cohesive, unified pillar behind it, and understanding each individual, like how they all relate together, adds to the minimizing inconsistency mapping that people are always doing whenever they hear any story. And so if you have 15 disjoint things that all are good, it doesn't matter. You can still be lacking the trust building in that as well. So we'll dive into that. That's one where we go for it, Simon.
Totally agree. I think like the most obvious things to me is, even despite us telling our founders like don't list features, list benefits, right? Which is akin to many of the things that you preach, Doug. We were so in the weeds. Like we were so in it in the day to day, and like we had a lot of assumptions that it's hard to clear those assumptions. So like just having you give us the raw and like candid feedback, which like you obviously have decades of experience doing this, because we've asked for feedback from so many people so many times, and it has never been nearly like a fraction of the value of one session with you, which was super, super valuable. So I encourage all the founders and also like emerging VCs out there to reach out to Doug and plead him for a free session. Hopefully, Doug will give you his valuable time, or a paid session, even better, or a free session that leads to many paid sessions. That was I think a big revelation. Just like getting out of the weeds and having you kind of redigest stuff and explain, hey, this is what the story sounds like And one of the big things, like Sabrina was saying, was we were just listing too many features and confusing people. And our new thesis, which is being very much more well received, is just focusing on our core tenets.
Mm-hmm. And I think the
I think the thing.
Go for it, Doug.
No, go ahead. I was going to just quickly respond to that. First of all, thank you. And by the way, I love talking about this. So if anybody wants to reach out, I'd be happy to chat with them. I love doing it. And but I think the thing that you're talking about as well is like people can provide feedback, but they don't really know. All they're doing is doing bits and pieces. It's like, well, this part struck me, or maybe it's like you need to have something that brings it all together. And the other thing that that I think happened for you all is that you also became as attentive to risk elements as you did the benefits, because what everybody does as well is their natural. It's like, what are our benefits, and how are we going to convey our benefits to somebody? And the reality is you need to pay as much attention to risk factors that can emerge again from the eyes and ears of the prospect, not whatever you're thinking. Because they can come from anywhere, and they're the smallest things. And in the human mind, 80% of our thoughts are negative. We are wired to look for where I could get hurt to survive. And so they're looking for any gaps, any inconsistencies, anything that could be construed as a potential problem to be like, thank you, I'm good. Just wanted to hit on that one because it's a huge factor that gets ignored a lot.
Yeah. And I think the feature listing plus what we just mentioned leads into another mind trap, which is the over-explainer. I think what happens is what we were doing in our pitch previously was that we had a bunch of features that we were listing, realizing they weren't quite landing, and then we'd have to tend to over-explain in order to compensate for the lack of perceived miscommunication, which was really confusing. And I think that is, one of the core mind traps I think that a lot of folks in the engineering deep tech discipline tend to fall into as well. It's like the combination of the feature listing, over-explaining, which is a risk from the receiver's standpoint, because they're now saying, okay, well, if they can't clearly communicate, then there must be an issue with what they're trying to say. And so really liked that framework that you had built out for us.
Yeah, I think that 100% happens all the time. Sort of the difference between the way I tend to think of it as an over-explainer versus a feature lister. At least the feature lister is clear, and it's a longer feature list, and it tends to be tech companies. So there's just more features to run through. The over-explainer are typically the people that are very, very passionate about what they do, but they just aren't as skilled in terms of telling a story. So there's people are very attracted to their passion, but then they get kind of concerned that I don't know if this person can actually execute on what they execute and scale. You see a lot of nonprofits being over-explainers, but it can happen anywhere. And, if you happen to be one of those individuals that relies on anecdotal stories too much, like, oh, here, we did this over here and we changed their lives and it was wonderful. And then there was this person over here. And, and having some stories to illustrate is great. I'm not saying that's not the case. It's when people rely on those anecdotes to be the verification of success rather than an example. That's when it becomes a problem.
Yeah. I would love to dive into the final mind trap that we wanted to talk about today, which is the tactician. Rombauer wine, excellent teaser at the beginning of the session, but would love to walk through that example, because I think that one is it's quite a bit different than the typical persona that we typically meet with in the VC land.
Yeah. I love the people at Rombauer. They actually just sold it to Gallo. Had an amazing exit. They're about $100 million winery in Napa. And you can kind of think about, wow, selling wine is a tough business because there's so many of them. And so I was actually on their board for a while. And so they were originally owned by a man by the name of Kerner Rombauer, who was one of the early individuals into the wine business in Napa Valley. Quite a character, lots of stories from all the different people. And he was the kind of guy who was like, if there's a worker in the field, he treated them just as well as a billionaire, didn't care. And he would talk to a worker in the be like, go grab a bottle of wine out of the fridge and bring it out and let's have a glass. And he didn't give a crap if it was $1,000 bottle of wine or a $20 bottle of wine. And he was like let's go. He was just that kind of it just froze on me.
Oh, we're back.
Okay?
Yep, we're back.
We're okay. Some Wi-Fi issues.
Can you hear me?
No worries.
You know?
Yeah,
okay.
we're good.
I'm not sure what happened. Yeah, sorry about that. So anyway, Kerner passed away a few years ago, and he, great team, continued to take the brand forward, but they really lost a lot of the passion and energy around the brand. So they were really focused on executing, doing great work. And so they landed on talking about, this is a family-owned business, which I'm like, I don't know how many family-owned vineyards. There are a gazillion of them. So that was one of their headline elements, a fine portfolio of wines. Again, another completely overdone thing, and we're a great company to work with. And it was all, there's no emotion. And so what we did was, in getting in and working with them, one of the things that I'd been very interested in is, I can, on the cork, they have other corks say the joy of wine on them. And they have that because Irma Rombauer wrote The Joy of Cooking. And so I was like, what about this whole joy thing? And they're like, well, that's the cookbook family and we can't control them. And, cookbooks are kind of outdated and, they're the ones that kind of have the joy factor. And then I started talking about what's the difference when I say family values, what comes to mind? And they're like, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of boring. And I'm like, tell me some of your Kerner stories. And the room, the energy was transformational. And so anyway, we ended up focusing on joy and joyful moments and creating joyful memories as the headline element. And in seeing that, what I said was like, you guys have more than enough joy to own joy in and of yourselves. So instead of family values, I'm like, what about making it Kerner's values? And that opened up all the storytelling kinds of things and changed the way that they spoke in the tasting rooms. I don't know if they ever followed through with it, but we talked about having a Kerner size pour rather than, which would be a big pour versus, kind of your standard tasting. But all the things that they would do with that. So instead of family values, it was Kerner values. And then instead of a portfolio of fine wines, we taught one of the things they have working for them was that this is a portfolio that it's a wine for the people. And we allowed them to tell the story that they expanded their portfolio because their customers wanted to stay with Rombauer, but they had a drinking occasion when they wanted a Pinot Noir and not a Chardonnay or not a Cab. So it was a wine for the people demanded by their passionate customer. They had the highest retention rate in the wine club business. And then the last piece was joyful moments. And what I want to do is create a reciprocating mindset that if I'm having a joyful moment, like I am right now with you all, I'm having a glass of Rombauer. And if I'm having a glass of Rombauer, that must be meaning that I'm having a joyful moment or a joyful memory. And so people would always have that loop that we would be triggering in their mind. and they loved it. They ran. I mean, people were crying in the room as we kind of got to the heart of the emotion of it. This is one of the things that I think is so powerful about the branding is like, it brings you back to your core purpose. It's like, why do we do this? Because the more time you spend saying all this stuff that is what you think you're supposed to say instead of what you really mean, it actually, I think, erodes your soul a little bit. So we got back to the heart and soul of why they really distinctively matter to the world. And the other wonderful thing it does for the brand and business is that every time they're going to go motion, like I know they're going to go do the Sauvignon Blanc. And instead, in the past, it would have been like, oh, what could we do? It's like, oh, a summer venue. We could pair it with this. And now it's like, no, every time it all is going to come back to joy or joyful moments and joyful memories, even though there's something specific for the varietal that will add up to that. So the single biggest factor that causes somebody to believe something true is the number of times they hear it. And so if you have a lot of noise around your story, you don't have a brand, you have a lot of different messages that leads to confusion, but owning your mountain means really claiming that. Mm-hmm. So it's now if you get a wine order from the club as well, on the box, it stamps handled with care, contains joy on the outside. The first thing when you open it, it's a big banner over the top, enjoying joyful moments. And, they just really leaned into the whole thing in really wonderful ways. And now they've created that conclusion. They had every employee created their story of how they bring joy to the world and how they do that through Rombauer. They use it in their training, their culture building. This is what we're about. You're an ambassador of joy, not just when you're working, but when you leave here. That's the type of person that we have. So this is why I say it's so much more than branding. It's a way of defining.
Absolutely. And I want to emphasize too that every single company has a mission that has there's a reason why people are building the companies that they're building, even the most technical of companies. And I think that thinking through how to bring that human element into the storytelling, not just the storytelling, but into like the mission of like what is driving the company forward, can be completely transformative to the resonance of the pillars that you create for your company as well. There's, Doug, so much more that we can dive into. And actually, I think we're just given the amount of time we have left, going to break out our Omni retrospective probably into a different session that will probably launch either on Doug's YouTube or our YouTube or something like this. And we'll save that for another time. But just the stories and the variety of the different companies that you've helped, it just really shows of how even disparate stories, even disparate people in different industries, there are some really core fundamental principles that can be relayed and followed to completely change the resonance of the messaging. And so we really, we have experienced it ourselves. We're a huge fan. Everyone should check out the RISE framework and Doug's book. And I think as we're wrapping up here, Doug, we have one more question for you. And that is, who has the most impactful person in your career been and why?
Yeah, so I would have to say I would give a huge shout out to Lisa Carter, who was my early boss when I worked at a company called Yankelovich Partners, and she and I did volumetric forecasting. I did the volumetric forecast for new products, which was a really amazing way to learn about business, honestly. And we had a really strong hit rate of being right 85% of the time. We'd be plus or minus 14% of total. But you had to learn everything about the product mix, the marketing mix, the messaging, distribution, messaging, everything. And so that was such a powerful means. And the other kind of cool thing was that she was the one in the company when anybody had a problem with their projects, they would come to her to fix them. And she was the fixer. And so I became the fixer by default. And so I learned a huge amount from her. And then, yeah, she actually came to work with me at my company when I started it. And she ended up running the Coca-Cola account. Yeah, she was an amazing individual. And that's where I got my start, was with her. So I'm incredibly grateful to her.
Oh, that's incredible. Cheers to her.
Cheers, Lisa.
Doug, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your stories. We really appreciate it. And we're excited to have more opportunities to share more of your learnings with our community as well. But I think for today, we'll end it here. Simon, do you want to sign us off?
Sure. Thanks so much, Doug. This has been Beers with VCs with Doug Harrison, and some great kombucha. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.